Welcome back to Breakfast Central. Thank you very much for joining us. In case you're just tuned in, you're right in time for a very important conversation about the environment, climate change, looking particularly at the floods in South Africa. Now, remember that South Africa's finance minister has described the KwaZulu-Natal floods as an eye-opener when it comes to the critical challenge that climate change is becoming for the country. Now, South Africa has experienced extreme flooding and several droughts over the last decade, suggesting changing weather patterns.
Yes, policymakers are urgently looking for solutions to the crisis, which is placing a strain on resources. Meanwhile, an analysis from the World Weather Attribution Group has shown that extreme rainfall is more common in southern Africa due to climate change. The report also shows that the region has been hit by 3 cyclones and 2 tropical storms in 6 weeks. And joining us now to delve deeper into this topic is a lecturer in the environmental fluid mechanics at the University of Kwazulu-Natal, Professor Justin Pringle. Thanks for joining us, Professor Pringle.
Yes, hi, thanks. I need to, I'm not a professor yet, so you can just call me by my first name.
Apologies for that, Justin. All right, amongst a few other specialties, your research is focused on climate change. What key insights have you gathered from your research, particularly relating to how and why climate change is presenting the way it is in South Africa at present?
Yeah, so my field of study is fluid mechanics, and that is really talking about how fluids move, fluids being liquids like water or gases. So you can see immediately how that's important when we're trying to figure out how climate change is occurring, what are the physics behind it, and some of the weather, the small time scale events like weather, etc., that occur. So you can see how fluid mechanics becomes quite important. And so, yeah, our research is focused on trying to develop, or using the principles of fluid mechanics to develop engineering solutions for the impact of climate change. Because one of the important things to notice is that while the floods, for example, that occurred at KZN, so we had about 300 millimeters of rain in a period of 24 hours, which for us is about a third of the rainfall in KwaZulu-Natal for an annual rainfall. So that caused quite a significant amount of flooding. But there are 2 different timescales that play out. So, for example, you have weather events. You mentioned earlier tropical cyclones and low pressure storm cells that frequent our region. These occur at timescales which are much shorter than, for example, global climate change. So global climate change, we're talking about changes that occur over decades. And so the difficulty in engineering and physics at the moment is to try and figure out ways to tie the 2 together. Because obviously you can predict, for example, using a global climate change model, what the possible temperature increase is going to be in, say, 100 years' time. But it's very difficult to try and predict how weather systems will move, for example, in 100 years' time, because they occur at very short time scales. And they often require a lot of computation in order to solve the governing physics behind why they move and how they move.
Okay, Justin. Now, we know that the port city of Durban has experienced flooding events almost every year since 2016. Now, why would you say that the flood that was witnessed in April was so severe? Is it a matter of infrastructure failures, or is it poor oversight?
I think it's one you touch on a very important point. So one of the big things, so just to put it in context, we have had what we call extreme events. So an extreme event in engineering is referring to an event that occurs quite rarely, but when it occurs, it's often associated with very large magnitude in, say, rainfall, or another important variable for us is wave climate. So you could also have very large waves, for example. But the problem is these events, which obviously come from the interaction between the weather and the local atmosphere, they don't occur often. So they occur infrequently. And so it means it's very difficult for us to try and predict how and these things are going to change. So to put it into context, from about 2016 to 2022, we've had very strong rainfall events in KwaZulu-Natal, where we've had about 160 millimeters of rain dropping over KwaZulu-Natal, also as a result of the same type of weather system that occurred this in the last month. However, the cutoff low, that is the type of weather system that we're referring to here, when that occurred in April, when that occurred, it dropped about 300 millimeters of rain in the space of 24 hours, and in the space of, I think it was 2 to 3 days, it was about 400 or so millimeters. So it was a significant amount of rainfall. So you can already see the complexity and the problem in that, from 2016, we had the same type of weather events, but they were only dropping 160 millimeters of rain in 24 hours. And now all of a sudden we have a very strong storm cell that occurs, very strong cutoff low, and it drops 300 millimeters in a space of 24 hours. So it's very difficult to try and predict that. And it's very difficult to try and design for that, and very costly. So typically when engineers look at a city, they try and predict the severity of storm events that are going to occur, rainfall events, and they try and figure out, okay, what is the balance between designing for the worst case scenario and what the economy can afford. And typically in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, we design for what we call a 1 in 10 year event. So it's a type of extreme event. It's linked with a probability of occurrence. So it has a 10% chance of occurring more frequently.
Okay, now let's talk about, the future. Are there certain things that the, South African government maybe, or South African people may need to start doing immediately because, this is likely going to get worse. So is there certain things that they must start doing, to help save, their KwaZulu-Natal or themselves moving forward, or is it too late?
Yeah, I would certainly say it's never too late. And I think actually it's more of a global challenge. So what we have to do, and it's also an African challenge, right? The whole continent is going to face all sorts of changes. So what we really need to come together to do as Africans is develop solutions for ourselves by investing in universities, educating our population, and developing the scientists and engineers that the world needs to confront these global challenges. And that is already happening. Governments throughout Africa and in South Africa do invest in universities and engineering, but essentially that's probably where what governments need to do is to actually start to rely on the engineers and the scientists to guide policy and develop solutions. Specifically for the African context as well as the global context. So I wouldn't say it's too late. It's just a matter of political and economic will.
All right, thank you very much, Justin, for speaking so extensively on what can be done to protect the people of South Africa and ensure that we prepare for the potential of future floods happening. And I'm hoping that we don't have to have conversations like this as often, because what needs to be done will be done. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.
All right.